Oh, hey there! Welcome back to my channel. My name's Aaron and I've got a brand new video for you. Today we're talking about the Fujifilm X100V and the Leica Q2. For me, I really like having an everyday carry camera, something more small, compact, portable, discreet, something that I don't use for work. So I shoot full-time. I currently am using Sony's full-frame mirrorless system, and for me those are my work cameras. I keep them tucked away on my days off, and I don't really feel super inspired to use those for casual shooting, photographing my kids, or street photography, stuff like that. I first was introduced to Fujifilm in early 2012. I booked a trip to Cuba and was doing some research online, and the very first thing that every single website or blog or whatever said was, don't bring a big giant DSLR. Boy, was I glad I bought the original X100 when I went on that trip. And it served me so well, and that was the first time I really had like a personal use camera. At the time I was shooting a really big full-frame DSLR, I think the Nikon D700, which is big and heavy. I had the 2.8 glass, fairly heavy lenses, and having something like this, especially on like vacation, just getting like those touristy snapshots was amazing. I'm really happy with how I'm just really happy with how the photos came out with that camera. From then on, after that, I actually traded into the X70 when that came out. Wasn't happy with that. Got the X100F, loved it, but the lens was getting a little bit soft at f2. That lens was the same lens all the way from the original to the F, and that lens was designed for 12 megapixel Bayer sensor, which that original X100 had. By the time they got to the X100F, they were on, I think, the third generation of an X-Trans sensor, correct me if I'm wrong, and that lens was not good at f2. Also, autofocus tracking or AFC mode was still really, really bad. So I upgraded to the X100V, and I've been extremely happy with it for my everyday camera, personal carry camera. But like a lot of you, I always have gas, and I always am looking to broaden my horizons, see what else is out there, potentially replace this with a full frame compact. So that's where the Q2 comes in. I was working at a camera store when the Q first came out, got my hands on it, saw the price tag, and thought anybody that would buy this camera would be out of their mind when there are other options like the Fuji and a couple of others. I honestly almost laughed it off, and I have never been a Leica fanboy, especially with digital. But once I found a few YouTube videos, thanks YouTube videos for instilling the gas into me, I just heard so many rave reviews about the lens, the sensor, the combination, the build quality, all of the good things about this camera. So I decided to rent the Q2 for a few days. I live in Minnesota, and unfortunately the day the camera arrived was the haziest, smokiest day, as we do have some wildfires here currently. So I didn't even go out the first day, and limited action the next couple days as it was still a bit smoky and hazy, which you probably will see in a few of the sort of landscape type shots. But let's address the elephant in the room. There is roughly a $4,000 price difference if buying these cameras new. Currently the Fuji is going to retail around $1,400 US, and the Leica currently is at $5,500 US. It was $5,000 for the longest time, and the price has recently went up to about $5,500. So we're going to round it off and say it's about a $4,000 difference. The main differences and specs can be found everywhere on the internet. That's not what my channel is about. I'm all about the experience of the camera, image qualities, but I'll give a really quick recap in case you're not familiar. So the Fuji X100V has an APS-C size sensor. It has a f2 lens and all the cool analog dials like ISO dial. A lot of people really feel like Fujifilm emulates a little bit of an experience of a film camera, and the film simulations as well are a big reason people love the Fujifilm cameras, not just the X100 line. I am super happy with the results I get from the Fuji. Let me just start there, but it's fun to have gas and think about an upgrade. It's just fun. So the Leica has a 28mm, so a little bit wider of a lens. This is technically a 23 on APS-C. If you want to think about the full frame equivalent, you're going to be at 35. So a little bit wider at 28. And I recently bought the 24 1.4 G Master for my Sony system, and I automatically fell in love with the wider focal length. So to my surprise, I think the 28 is my new favorite focal length, almost immediately. I've always liked a little bit wider than 35, and this is what you get. So again, full frame sensor, 47 point something megapixels. As you all know, it's all about the lens and the sensor. The rest of it's buttons and dials and specs. We've got a 28mm f1.7. It is absolutely gorgeous. That is the Summilux version, and it's spherical. One kind of quirky thing about the camera is there are 0 ports nothing, no little doors to open, and Leica claims that is giving it superb weather seal, and I think I buy that. Underneath, we've just got this cool little battery door. You flip that, you tap it, and it comes out, so it's not gonna automatically or accidentally drop out if you hit that lever. And we've got one card slot, just like the Fuji X100V. We're also going to have macro mode, which I'll get into when I start showing you a few examples. And manual focus is fantastic with the focus peaking. So this video is not really about which one should you buy. It's sort of just explaining the differences between two cameras that are sort of in the same category. I don't feel like I would ever just own one of these cameras and call it a day. I've got a full kit for professional shoots like weddings, engagement sessions, things like that. So again, this is more of like an everyday carry for me. There are a few other options in the marketplace. Ricoh's got the GR3, which is a little bit closer to the Fuji, where it's got the same size sensor, but it's a 28 focal length. Sony also has a full frame compact. I don't even remember what it's called because in my opinion, the camera is the most overpriced camera in the market, and the lens I don't think is that good. So is this camera worth about $4,000 more, and will I be selling this? I'm honestly not quite sure yet. So the idea behind renting this camera was just to see if it will potentially replace my Fuji, and I've never rented a camera before. I've always had the luxury of trying out cameras at the camera store that I worked at up until the pandemic hit. And so yeah, I threw down almost $300 from Lens Rentals, not sponsored. And so far the experience has been really good. They send you even packaging tape and all the things that you need to easily drop it back off at FedEx. And they've already sent me a 15% off my next rental, which scares me because I would really like to try the Q2 monochrome. All right, let's have a look at some of the example images. As you can see, I've got the Leica on the right and Fuji on the left. And I included the ISO, f-stop, and shutter speed. For the most part, settings were exactly the same, and if they're not, they'll be listed, and it didn't make much of a difference. As for editing, these are pretty much straight out of the camera raw, except for a few I did the black and white JPEGs. So if I did any editing at all, for example, if I brought the highlights up or down a little bit, it was very minor, and I made sure to do the exact same on the other image. I think I took a step forward on the Leica, just to kind of get the same perspective. Here's a great example just showing the difference between 35mm and 28mm. As for colors, contrast, everything, these images really look very similar. I tried the 35mm crop mode on the Leica for this one, so they're going to be pretty equal. I just noticed the white balance is definitely a lot more accurate on the Leica. The white paint in the background was spot on. I think the light came out just a tiny bit more on the shot with the Leica, so it was just a tiny bit brighter with the same settings. After I took these images, I checked the back screens of the cameras because I could just tell the colors were pretty far off from what my eye was seeing, although the Leica was definitely closer to what the scene actually looks like. Super similar again on this one. The propane tank on the Fuji might have a little bit more of an off-white, but otherwise super similar. On this one I definitely prefer the 35mm focal length, just how the shot is framed up, but you get a good example of, how much wider you'd get with the 28. On this one, the Leica definitely looks a little bit cleaner and sharper, in my opinion. So I zoomed in a little bit, unfortunately not quite as much on the Leica that I'm just now noticing. But even at ISO 400, due to the high resolution of the Leica camera, we're gonna have a little bit more noise. So sort of underneath the rooftop, in the shadows, we see a little bit of noise. But the overall sharpness is definitely superior, especially with those spots where you can kind of see some rust on the rooftop. My bike is like a matte black, so in my opinion the Leica colors are spot on, even with like the tan and browns and the greens in the background. A little bit more of a blue cast in my opinion on the Fujifilm. Leica has a whole separate macro mode, and in my opinion you can't even really get that close. I wouldn't even consider this macro. Although with the Fuji X100V, you can get incredibly close. Much closer than a Leica. Another good example of just the focal length of the 28 versus the 35. Brought up the ISO on a few images here, and it looks pretty nice. That first day I was out, it was super smoky out, unfortunately. There were very few people walking around what was normally a really popular area in Minneapolis. Sat down and had a chat with this guy, super nice guy. I was about to leave and I just asked him if I could take a couple photos, and he was all about it. With Fuji, it's got the eye autofocus where it sort of automatically tracks the eye, which is, really nice. But even with just the regular single point autofocus with the Leica, I definitely see a lot more sharpness in the eye. Pay no attention to the background. Obviously, we're going to get more background blur as I accidentally had the Leica wide open and the Fuji I did not. Nice little landscape shot here. This will be the second one that I did the black and white JPEG straight out of the camera, and much more contrast with the Leica. Overall, I really like both images though. I drive by this wall almost every day. It's right next door to a sandwich shop that I go to all the time, and the colors on the Leica are spot on with that white wall. The Fuji's definitely a bit off here. This gives a great example of the extra resolution we're going to get with the Leica. Even with the Leica being a wider shot, I zoomed in the equal amount, and still much sharper with the Leica due to the 47 megapixels, where clearly the Fuji is going to get a little bit kind of muddy, murky, foggy. I'm not really sure what's happening, but it does not look that great zoomed way in. A little bit of an unfair comparison here, as I had the hood on the Leica and I did not have a lens hood on the Fuji, so I think a little bit extra light kind of crept in the side there. Overall, super nice. I really like the color and contrast coming out of the Leica Q on this one. And here's the final black and white JPEG straight from the camera. I cranked the ISO up to 6400, which is probably the highest I'd comfortably shoot with both of these cameras. Punching in, you can see just so much more contrast and unfortunately a lot more grain and digital noise coming from the Leica. Again, that's due to the higher resolution. So I'd say the Fuji kind of wins in this one. I definitely think that both Leica and Fuji are the top two brands for sort of emulating film grain. You know, we kind of call it digital noise, but I think both these manufacturers do a nicer job than the big three full frame, you know, from Sony, Canon, and Nikon. So I hope you enjoyed those images. I'd like to just now briefly talk about some of the pros and the cons of the Leica Q2. So most importantly, as I mentioned before, it's the lens and the sensor combo that's going to give you the fantastic images, assuming you know how to operate the camera. And this lens camera sensor is probably the best I've ever seen. The image quality is absolutely superb. The JPEGs, the colors, the white balance, the flexibility of the RAW files, all of those things are fantastic. The JPEGs that are black and white that come out of this are like butter. Like, I don't even want to edit them. They're absolutely perfect straight out of the camera, which is why, like I said a second ago, the Q2 monochrome is extremely tempting. To shoot super high ISOs with black and white would be awesome, but I feel like I still need the color. Again, the lens, it's stabilized. I shot a few at really slow shutter speeds and got phenomenal results. And I mentioned before, the 28mm I think is now my favorite fixed focal length, which surprised me quite a lot. A really neat thing is with both of these cameras, you can punch in. It's just a digital crop. It's not going to actually change the look and feel of your photo. It's going to be the same compression, for example. But it's really neat. If you actually want to shoot a 35 on this, you are going to get your frame lines much like a rangefinder, specifically a Leica rangefinder. One thing that people really like about that is you can see your subject sort of enter the frame, and then all of a sudden your subject might hit that 35 crop lines and you shoot. It's a really cool experience, and you're still going to get 30 megapixels at 35, and that's right around what the Fuji is at its normal 35. Again, you can punch in to a 50 and a 75, and again on the 28 here on the Leica you can punch in to 35, 50, and 75. I personally only tried the 35. It's probably all I would try, maybe the 50. The great part is that really just affects your JPEGs, just like if you shoot like a black and white JPEG. As long as you're going to shoot a RAW, you are still going to get color, for example, and you're still going to get the original 28 focal length. For example, if you wanted to try out that 50, just for like framing up your shot or to see what you get, you can absolutely do that, and you'll have your JPEG ready to go, shoot it out, send it out. But you also have the RAW file if you choose to shoot RAW and JPEG together. And again, we'll have the full color 28mm, which I think is just perfect. It's a great option. So let's talk about a few of the cons, and there's not too many, and they're not too bad, to be honest. It's a little bit weird that our shutter speed with the leaf shutter is only going to go to 2000, and for example, we're going to have on the dial, 2000 and 1000, but then you have to use this other dial to get the shutter speeds in between that, and that is very much like the Fuji, with the exception of this. And this is how I shoot my Fuji. I actually go to this T mode, and then I get full control of every shutter speed here. But of course on the Fuji I do have that same option as the Leica, where I could go to the 1000 and then just have that little bit of range between 1000 and 2000 on this dial. But I really like going to this T mode with the Fuji, and you can just use the back rocker to really get any shutter speed, and that's what I prefer. Again, not a big deal, and I got used to it super fast using the Leica. Secondly is the ISO stops. So we're not getting sort of the incremental stops, we're just getting the big ones. For example, it's going to go from 800 to 16 to 32 to 64, where with the Fuji we're going to have the ISOs in between there, and that is quite nice to have. but not a huge deal breaker. I get they're keeping the camera really simple. So in the cons list, I'm going to put the price, even though I think it's worth every penny, especially when you look at the market of Leica M mount lenses, for example. They're going to have a couple different options for the 28, and they're pretty much as expensive as this whole system. So if you look at it in Fuji land, this is definitely a good value, but it's a heck of a lot of money for the average person. So I personally gave it lots of thought. If I were to purchase the Q2, I would probably have to sell a few things to get even half of the funds back. So I'd sell my Leica CL. I've got a mint one with the 40. Everyone says their gear is mint. This is truly mint, and I've had it CLA'd. I've got the 90 f4 to pair with it, and I would have to sell my Sony 135, which I use the least amount, so I could see it going, and I would have to sell my beloved Fuji, which, again, selling 3 to 4 really nice pieces to only get half the funds for this one camera is a hard pill to swallow. So for me, I'm personally not buying it now. I'm super glad I rented it. There's a chance I'll buy it in the future, and if I do, I'll be sure to let you know. But again, if you got that kind of cash to throw around, it's worth every penny, and you should grab it. For me, I'm gonna hold off for a little while. Thanks so much for checking out my review on these two cameras, and I hope I'll see you soon. Take care.